In October 1923, construction workers breaking ground for a new grain silo on what was once the Grimstead property in rural Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, made a discovery that would haunt the community for generations. Beneath 3 feet of carefully packed earth, they uncovered the first of what would eventually be identified as 143 small graves, each containing the remains of children aged between 5 and 12 years old. The Pennsylvania State Police immediately sealed the site, and within hours, orders came down from Harrisburg to halt all excavation and classify the findings under the Public Safety Protection Act. Between 1892 and 1896, over 143 children who attended the Grimstead family Sunday school simply never returned home. What the authorities tried to bury for nearly 3 decades can no longer remain hidden, and this story isn't for everyone. Only those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of Pennsylvania's forgotten history should continue listening to this tale. If you're ready to join our community of true mystery seekers who refuse to let these crimes stay buried, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from, because this story reaches far beyond Pennsylvania's borders. The Grimstead family arrived in Clearfield County during the harsh winter of 1891, claiming to be traveling missionaries seeking to establish a permanent religious settlement. Ezekiel Grimstead, a tall man with piercing blue eyes and a voice that could fill any room without effort, quickly gained the trust of local families struggling through one of the region's most difficult economic periods. His wife Martha, a woman with gentle hands and a nurse's training from Philadelphia, won over the community's mothers by treating their children's ailments without charge. Their 3 adult children completed what appeared to be the perfect Christian family. Samuel, the eldest at 28, possessed his father's commanding presence and handled all business matters with meticulous precision. Rebecca, 25, had inherited her mother's nurturing demeanor and showed remarkable patience with even the most difficult children. The youngest son, Daniel, barely 22, demonstrated an unusual talent for woodworking and quickly established himself as the area's most skilled carpenter. The family purchased a sprawling property on the outskirts of town, complete with a large farmhouse and several outbuildings that Samuel immediately began converting into what he called educational facilities. Within months of their arrival, they had established the Clearfield County Children's Sunday School, offering not just religious instruction but also basic education, hot meals, and medical care for any child whose parents would allow them to attend. Local families, many struggling to feed their children through the economic depression gripping the region, saw the Grimstead Sunday School as a blessing from heaven itself. Parents could send their children for entire weekends, knowing they would receive 3 meals a day, clean clothes, and instruction in reading and arithmetic alongside their religious education. The program grew rapidly from a handful of local children to drawing families from neighboring counties who made the journey specifically to enroll their children in what they believed was an exemplary Christian education program. Martha Grimstead's medical background proved invaluable to the community, as she treated everything from childhood fevers to broken bones with a competence that impressed even the county's only doctor. Her husband's sermons drew standing room-only crowds every Sunday, and his passionate pleas for the spiritual welfare of the region's children resonated deeply with parents who worried about their children's futures in an increasingly uncertain world. The warning signs were there from the beginning, but desperate parents chose to ignore them or explain them away as the eccentricities of deeply religious people. Children who attended the Sunday school began speaking in hushed tones about special lessons that only certain students received, about rooms in the basement that were off-limits to most attendees, and about children who were selected for extended stays that sometimes lasted weeks. When parents inquired about these extended absences, Ezekiel would explain that some children required intensive spiritual guidance to overcome what he termed hereditary moral deficiencies. He would produce detailed charts and medical-looking documents that purported to show each child's spiritual progress, complete with Martha's professional-looking signature and official-seeming stamps. The parents, most of whom could barely read, were impressed by the scientific approach the Grimsteads claimed to take toward their children's moral development. The family's reputation for charitable work extended beyond their Sunday school activities. they regularly took in what they called temporary orphans, children whose parents had died or abandoned them, and claimed to be working with county officials to find permanent homes for these unfortunate souls. The Grimsteads maintained detailed records of their charitable activities, producing ledgers filled with names, dates, and destinations whenever local authorities made their infrequent visits to inspect their operations. By 1894, the Grimstead Sunday School had become such an integral part of the region's social fabric that few questioned the family's methods or their unprecedented success in managing what they claimed was the largest children's program in central Pennsylvania. The family had cultivated relationships with key officials throughout the county, including Deputy Sheriff Thomas Winters, who frequently praised their work in his reports to the state capitol and ensured that any complaints or concerns were handled at the local level without outside interference. The Grimstead family's background revealed a carefully constructed facade that masked decades of preparation for their Pennsylvania operation. Ezekiel claimed to have studied theology at Princeton Seminary, but records from that institution contained no mention of his enrollment. His supposed medical training, which he used to justify Martha's nursing activities, consisted of a single certificate from a correspondence course based in Chicago that had been investigated for fraud 3 years before the family's arrival in Clearfield County. Martha's nursing credentials proved equally suspicious upon closer examination. While she possessed genuine knowledge of medical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations, her training had been acquired through employment at the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, an institution known for its experimental treatments on patients who had no legal advocates. Her departure from Danvers in 1889 coincided with an internal investigation into the unexplained deaths of 17 patients under her direct care, though official records of this investigation were sealed by court order. Samuel Grimstead's business acumen had been developed through years of managing his father's previous ventures, which included a traveling medicine show that operated throughout the Midwest during the 1880s. The show's success had been built on Samuel's ability to identify communities with high concentrations of vulnerable populations, particularly families with children who possessed no extended family networks or official documentation of their existence. Rebecca's remarkable patience with children stemmed from her role as the family's primary talent scout, a position that required her to spend months in each community identifying potential targets and mapping family structures. Her gentle demeanor and genuine affection for children made her particularly effective at gaining the trust of both parents and their offspring, creating emotional bonds that would later prevent children from reporting the family's activities to outside authorities. Daniel's woodworking skills served purposes far beyond community service, as his modifications to the family's properties included the construction of soundproof rooms, hidden passages, and specialized furniture designed to facilitate the family's operations. His work on the Clearfield County property had begun immediately upon their arrival, with the basement areas receiving his most careful attention and the installation of ventilation systems that would prevent detection of activities conducted below ground level. The family's integration into the community followed a pattern they had perfected through years of practice in other locations. They began by identifying the most influential families and tailoring their approach to address each family's specific needs and vulnerabilities. For families struggling economically, they offered free services and financial assistance. For families with social ambitions, they provided connections to what they claimed were important religious and political figures throughout the state. Their Sunday school program served as the perfect vehicle for gaining access to large numbers of children while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious and educational activities. The program's rapid growth provided cover for the family's true purposes, as the constant flow of new students made it difficult for anyone to maintain accurate counts of attendance or to notice when particular children stopped appearing. The selection process for children who would receive special attention followed criteria that the family had developed through years of experimentation. Children from families with no extended relatives, those whose parents worked long hours or traveled frequently for employment, and those whose behavior suggested they might be less likely to report unusual activities were systematically identified and gradually separated from the general population of students. Parents who expressed concerns about their children's extended absences were reassured through a combination of Martha's medical authority and Ezekiel's religious expertise. The family would explain that certain children required intensive intervention to address what they termed spiritual and developmental deficiencies, producing documentation that appeared to support their recommendations for extended treatment programs. The community's gratitude for the family's services created a protective environment that discouraged questioning of their methods or investigation of their claims. Local officials, impressed by the family's apparent success in managing difficult children and their willingness to provide services that the county could not afford, became advocates for the program and actively discouraged complaints or concerns from parents who might otherwise have demanded more detailed explanations of the family's activities. This story reveals how easily communities can be manipulated when desperate circumstances create opportunities for exploitation, and how authority figures can become complicit in unspeakable crimes through their failure to ask the right questions. If you're finding this investigation into one of Pennsylvania's most buried secrets as disturbing as we are, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with someone who can handle the truth about what happened in Clearfield County. The Grimstead family's operational methods revealed a systematic approach to child exploitation that had been refined through years of practice in other locations. Their Sunday school program served as both recruitment center and processing facility, with different areas of their property designated for specific stages of their operation. The main classroom housed general religious instruction for the majority of students, while smaller rooms were reserved for what the family called individual counseling sessions. Children selected for special attention were gradually separated from the general population through a process that appeared to be based on academic and spiritual merit. Rebecca would identify children who demonstrated particular intelligence or artistic ability, explaining to their parents that these exceptional students required advanced instruction that could only be provided through intensive one-year-known sessions. Parents, flattered by the suggestion that their children possessed special talents, readily agreed to extended weekend stays and even week-long programs. The basement facilities that Daniel had constructed included medical examination rooms where Martha conducted what she described as health assessments required for participation in advanced programs. These examinations served multiple purposes, including the identification of children who might be suffering from malnutrition or abuse at home, conditions that made them less likely to be missed if they disappeared for extended periods. Samuel maintained detailed records of each child's family situation, including information about parents' work schedules, extended family relationships, and financial circumstances. This intelligence gathering allowed the family to predict which children could be absent for longer periods without generating immediate concern from their families. Children whose parents worked in logging camps or traveling sales positions were particularly valuable, as their extended absences could be explained as educational opportunities that coincided with their parents' work obligations. The family's first confirmed victims were 3 siblings from a family whose father had died in a mining accident and whose mother had been committed to the state asylum following what local authorities termed a complete mental collapse. 8-year-old Thomas, 6-year-old Mary, and 5-year-old Catherine had been living with neighbors who were struggling to feed their own children and welcomed the Grimsteads' offer to provide long-term care for the orphaned siblings. Within 6 months of taking responsibility for the children, the Grimsteads reported that all 3 had been successfully placed with Christian families in distant communities. They produced letters supposedly written by the children to their former neighbors, describing their happiness in their new homes and expressing gratitude for the care they had received. The letters, written in adult handwriting but signed with childish signatures, satisfied the neighbors' concerns and established a pattern that the family would use repeatedly. The disposal of evidence followed procedures that demonstrated careful planning and medical knowledge. Martha's background had provided her with detailed understanding of human anatomy and decomposition processes, while Daniel's construction skills enabled the creation of facilities that could accommodate the family's needs without detection. The property's remote location and the family's reputation for charitable work provided perfect cover for activities that required privacy and generated unusual amounts of construction activity. As their confidence grew, the Grimsteads began accepting children from increasingly distant communities, advertising their educational and charitable services through religious publications and word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied parents. Their reputation spread throughout central Pennsylvania and into neighboring states, with families making journeys of several days to enroll their children in what they believed was an exceptional Christian education program. The family's growing success required expansion of their network to include individuals who could provide specialized services and official documentation. Deputy Sheriff Thomas Winters proved invaluable in creating false records and providing advance warning of any official investigations. Dr. Benjamin Crawford, the county's medical examiner, assisted in producing death certificates and medical reports that supported the family's explanations for children who had supposedly died from natural causes while under their care. Local businessman Harrison Mills, who owned the area's largest general store, provided supplies and equipment that the family required for their operations, while also serving as a source of information about families who might be experiencing financial difficulties that would make them receptive to the Grimstead's offers of assistance. His position in the community gave him access to detailed knowledge of every family's circumstances and vulnerabilities. The systematic nature of their operation extended to financial planning, with Samuel maintaining separate accounts for different aspects of their business. Legitimate donations from grateful parents were kept in accounts that could withstand official scrutiny, while profits from their illegal activities were managed through a network of accounts in different names and locations. The family's apparent prosperity was carefully calibrated to appear consistent with successful religious and educational work, avoiding the ostentatious displays of wealth that might generate suspicion about their true sources of income. The Grimstead family's victim selection criteria evolved into a sophisticated system that prioritized children based on multiple risk factors that reduced the likelihood of their disappearances generating official investigations. Children from single-parent households headed by widowed mothers struggling with poverty ranked highest on their target list, particularly when those mothers worked as domestic servants or seamstresses whose long hours prevented regular supervision of their children's activities. Immigrant families presented especially attractive opportunities, as language barriers and unfamiliarity with American legal systems made these parents less likely to successfully navigate official channels if their children disappeared. The Grimstead specifically targeted recent arrivals from Ireland and Eastern European countries, families who had not yet established extensive social networks that might notice missing children or advocate for investigations. Children with physical disabilities or developmental delays became priority targets because their parents often felt grateful for any institution willing to provide specialized care. The Grimsteads exploited this desperation by claiming expertise in treating conditions that mainstream medical practitioners considered hopeless, offering experimental treatments that they claimed had achieved remarkable success with similar cases in other locations. The family refined their documentation methods to create increasingly sophisticated false records that could withstand casual official scrutiny. Samuel developed relationships with clerks in multiple county offices, providing small bribes in exchange for access to official forms and stamps that enabled the creation of convincing transfer documents, death certificates, and adoption papers that appeared to account for every child who entered their program. Martha's medical knowledge enabled the family to exploit children's health conditions as justification for extended treatment programs that isolated victims from their families for weeks or months. She would diagnose common childhood ailments as symptoms of serious underlying conditions requiring intensive intervention, producing detailed treatment plans that impressed parents with their apparent medical sophistication while providing cover for the family's true activities. The evolution of their methodology included the development of what they called the preparatory program, a months-long process of psychological conditioning that made children compliant and unlikely to resist or report the family's activities. This program began with seemingly innocent activities like special meals, individual attention, and small gifts, gradually escalating to isolation from other children and introduction to activities that normalized inappropriate adult behavior. Rebecca's role expanded to include the management of children who showed resistance to the family's conditioning efforts. Her genuine affection for children made her particularly effective at breaking down psychological barriers, as victims found it difficult to reconcile her apparent kindness with the increasingly disturbing nature of their experiences. She developed techniques for identifying children who might attempt to escape or report their situation, implementing additional security measures for these high-risk cases. The property's layout underwent continuous modification to accommodate the family's expanding operations and evolving security needs. Daniel constructed additional underground facilities that included storage areas, processing rooms, and disposal systems that eliminated evidence of the family's activities. The basement complex eventually extended beneath multiple buildings on the property, connected by tunnels that enabled movement without surface visibility. Their reputation for successful rehabilitation of difficult children attracted referrals from other religious institutions and government agencies throughout the region. Orphanages regularly transferred children who had proven unmanageable, while county poorhouses sent children whose families could no longer afford their care. These official referrals provided perfect cover for the family's acquisition of victims while simultaneously reducing the likelihood that anyone would investigate the children's subsequent disappearances. The Grimsteads began accepting payment for their services, charging fees that varied based on the complexity of each case and the resources required for successful resolution. Wealthy families paid premium rates for discreet handling of children whose behavior threatened family reputations, while government agencies provided steady income through contracts for managing institutional overflow. This diversification of revenue sources enabled the family to expand their operations while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activities. Quality control became increasingly important as their operation grew, with the family implementing systematic review processes to identify weaknesses in their procedures and improve their success rates. Samuel maintained detailed statistical records that tracked the effectiveness of different selection criteria, conditioning techniques, and disposal methods, using this data to refine their approach and minimize risks of detection. The network of accomplices expanded to include individuals in distant communities who could provide services that the local network could not safely deliver. These connections enabled the family to dispose of evidence across multiple jurisdictions while creating false documentation that placed missing children in locations far from Clearfield County. The geographic distribution of their network made investigation nearly impossible given the limited communication and transportation capabilities of late 19th century law enforcement agencies. By 1894, the Grimstead operation had reached its peak efficiency, processing an average of 3 children per month through what they euphemistically called their comprehensive rehabilitation program. Their network had expanded to include accomplices in 7 counties across Pennsylvania and extending into Ohio and West Virginia, creating a regional infrastructure that enabled the systematic exploitation of vulnerable children throughout the entire Mid-Atlantic region. The family's success attracted attention from similar operations in other parts of the country, leading to the establishment of what amounted to a professional association of individuals engaged in child trafficking activities. These connections provided access to specialized knowledge, advanced techniques, and expanded markets for their services, while also creating opportunities for collaboration on particularly challenging cases that required resources beyond what any single operation could provide. Samuel's business relationships extended to buyers in major cities who paid premium prices for children with specific characteristics. The demand for young workers in textile factories, domestic service positions, and other industries where small hands and unquestioning obedience provided economic advantages created a steady market for children who could be provided with convincing documentation of their availability for employment. Martha's medical expertise enabled the family to offer specialized services that commanded higher prices and attracted clients from wealthy families throughout the region. Her ability to provide discreet medical procedures, create convincing documentation of deaths from natural causes, and treat injuries that might result from resistance or escape attempts made her an invaluable resource for the network's most challenging cases. The underground facilities had expanded to include specialized areas for different stages of processing, with separate sections for initial intake, conditioning, medical procedures, and final preparation for disposal or transfer. The complexity of these facilities required Daniel to develop increasingly sophisticated ventilation and drainage systems that could handle the operations requirements without creating detectable evidence of their activities. Rebecca's role evolved to include training other members of the network in psychological manipulation techniques that had proven most effective with different types of children. Her methods were documented in detailed manuals that were distributed to other operations, creating standardized procedures that improved success rates across the entire network while reducing the risk of children successfully resisting or escaping. The family's reputation for discretion and reliability attracted clients whose requirements extended beyond simple disposal of unwanted children. They began accepting contracts for eliminating potential witnesses to other crimes, managing children who had observed activities that could threaten powerful individuals, and providing long-term care for children whose continued existence posed risks to established business or political interests. Local law enforcement had become so thoroughly compromised that Deputy Sheriff Winters was able to provide advance warning of any investigations while also suppressing reports from concerned community members who might have noticed suspicious activities. His influence extended to county-level officials who controlled funding and assignments for law enforcement activities, ensuring that resources were never allocated to investigations that might threaten the network's operations. Dr. Crawford's medical authority enabled the creation of official documentation that supported whatever explanations the family provided for children's disappearances. His death certificates, medical reports, and expert testimony in legal proceedings provided unassailable official validation for the family's claims about children who had supposedly died from natural causes or been transferred to specialized medical facilities in distant locations. The economic impact of their operation had become significant enough to influence local business activities, with several merchants depending heavily on the family's purchases of supplies and equipment. This economic integration created additional incentives for community members to avoid asking questions about the family's activities, as any disruption to their operation would have negative consequences for multiple local businesses. If this investigation into how an entire community became complicit in systematic child exploitation is affecting you as deeply as it's affecting us, we need you to share this story with others who are strong enough to confront these buried truths. Hit that like button to support our efforts to bring these forgotten crimes to light, and don't forget to subscribe because stories like this one require tremendous research and courage to tell. The family's confidence in their methods and their network's protection reached the point where they began accepting increasingly risky contracts that required them to target children from more prominent families. These high-profile cases provided substantially higher profits but also increased the potential for investigations that could threaten their entire operation. Samuel's analysis indicated that the financial benefits justified the additional risks, a calculation that would ultimately prove to be a fatal error in judgment. The peak period of their operation coincided with the region's economic recovery, which reduced the number of desperate families willing to entrust their children to institutional care. This change in circumstances forced the family to modify their recruitment strategies, relying more heavily on deception and outright kidnapping rather than the voluntary surrender of children by overwhelmed parents. The first serious threat to the Grimstead operation emerged in late 1894 when Margaret Sullivan, a widowed Irish immigrant, began asking persistent questions about her 7-year-old son Patrick, who had supposedly been transferred to a Catholic orphanage in Pittsburgh. Margaret's inquiries became problematic when she traveled to Pittsburgh and discovered that no such orphanage existed at the address provided in the Grimstead documentation, prompting her to contact church authorities who confirmed that no transfer had been arranged. Samuel's initial response followed standard procedures for managing suspicious parents, offering Margaret additional documentation that purported to show Patrick had been moved to a different facility due to medical complications. However, Margaret's determination proved unusually persistent, and her connections within the Irish immigrant community provided her with resources and support that enabled her to continue her investigation despite the family's attempts at misdirection. The situation escalated when Margaret convinced Father Michael O'Brien, the priest at St. Patrick's Catholic Church, to write letters of inquiry to religious institutions throughout Pennsylvania on her behalf. These official inquiries, written on church letterhead and signed by a recognized religious authority, could not be dismissed as easily as the complaints of a grieving mother, forcing the Grimsteads to implement more aggressive countermeasures. Martha's medical authority was deployed to create documentation suggesting that Patrick had died from tuberculosis while under their care, a common childhood disease that would explain why his death had not been immediately reported to his mother. The death certificate, bearing Dr. Crawford's official signature and the county seal, appeared to resolve Margaret's concerns while providing legal closure that should have ended her investigation. However, Margaret's refusal to accept the death certificate without seeing her son's grave created a new crisis that required immediate action. The family had never anticipated a parent demanding physical proof of a child's death, and their disposal methods had not included provisions for creating convincing burial sites that could withstand close examination by grieving relatives. Daniel's construction skills were rapidly deployed to create a false grave in the local cemetery, complete with a properly carved headstone and evidence of recent burial. The grave contained the remains of an adult woman who had died in the county poorhouse, but whose body had been claimed by the Grimsteads for what they described as Christian burial services for the indigent. Rebecca's psychological manipulation techniques proved insufficient to convince Margaret to abandon her investigation, as the mother's grief and determination overcame the emotional pressure that had successfully controlled other parents in similar situations. Margaret's public expressions of doubt about the family's explanations began attracting attention from other community members who had never questioned the Grimsteads' activities. The elimination of Margaret Sullivan became necessary when her investigations expanded to include contact with state authorities in Harrisburg who had the resources and authority to conduct official investigations that could expose the entire operation. Samuel's decision to authorize her murder represented a significant escalation in the family's methods, moving beyond the elimination of children to include adults who posed threats to their security. Martha's medical knowledge enabled the administration of poison that mimicked the symptoms of common illnesses, allowing Margaret's death to appear natural while eliminating the threat she represented. The timing of her death, occurring just days before she was scheduled to meet with state investigators, was explained as a tragic coincidence that demonstrated God's mysterious ways in resolving earthly conflicts. Father O'Brien's continued interest in Margaret's case required additional measures, as his religious authority and connections to church hierarchy in Philadelphia created the potential for investigations that extended beyond local control. The family's network included individuals with influence within religious institutions, but eliminating a Catholic priest would generate the type of attention that could destroy their entire operation. The solution involved compromising Father O'Brien through the discovery of his relationship with a young woman in the community, information that Samuel had obtained through careful surveillance and documentation. The priest's cooperation was secured through threats to expose this relationship to church authorities, effectively ending his advocacy for Margaret Sullivan and other parents who might have similar concerns. Dr. Crawford's position became increasingly precarious as the number of death certificates he was required to produce began attracting attention from state medical authorities who monitored unusual patterns in rural mortality rates. The family was forced to diversify their documentation sources, developing relationships with medical professionals in neighboring counties who could provide similar services with less risk of detection. Deputy Sheriff Winters implemented enhanced security measures that included surveillance of community members who had expressed concerns about missing children or the Grimstead family's activities. This intelligence gathering enabled the early identification of potential threats while providing opportunities to implement countermeasures before investigations could gain momentum. The family's response to these security challenges included the development of contingency plans for rapid evacuation and evidence destruction if their operation was threatened by investigations they could not control or suppress. These plans involved the systematic elimination of all physical evidence and the removal of key family members to predetermined locations where they could establish new identities and resume their activities. The arrival of Reverend William Hayes in the spring of 1895 introduced an element that the Grimstead family had not anticipated in their security planning. Hayes, a traveling Methodist minister conducting a circuit through central Pennsylvania, possessed both the religious authority to ask pointed questions about the Sunday school's operations and the independence from local power structures that made him immune to the pressure tactics that had silenced other potential critics. Hayes's initial observations focused on inconsistencies in the attendance records that the Grimsteads maintained for their educational programs. His experience managing religious schools in other communities had taught him to recognize patterns that indicated problems, and the unusually high turnover rate among students at the Grimstead facility immediately attracted his professional attention and concern. The minister's background included training in investigative techniques that he had developed during his service as a Union Army chaplain, where his duties had included documenting war crimes and gathering evidence for military tribunals. This experience had taught him to recognize the signs of systematic abuse and to understand the importance of preserving evidence that could withstand official scrutiny. Reverend Hayes began his investigation by conducting discreet interviews with parents whose children had attended the Grimstead Sunday School, carefully avoiding direct accusations while gathering information about their experiences and any concerns they might have developed. His religious authority and reputation for confidentiality encouraged parents to share doubts and suspicions that they had previously kept to themselves. The pattern that emerged from these interviews revealed troubling inconsistencies in the explanations that the Grimstead family had provided for children's extended absences and eventual disappearances. Multiple parents reported receiving nearly identical letters supposedly written by their children, describing similar experiences in institutions that careful investigation revealed either did not exist or had no record of receiving transferred students. Sheriff Robert McClellan, recently appointed to replace the retiring sheriff who had enabled Deputy Wintersy's corruption, proved receptive to Reverend Hayes's concerns and possessed both the authority and inclination to conduct official investigations into the activities at the Grimstead property. McClellan's military background and lack of previous connections to local power structures made him immune to the influence networks that had protected the family's operations. The sheriff's initial investigation focused on reviewing official documentation related to children who had supposedly been transferred from the Grimstead facility to other institutions. His systematic examination of transfer records, death certificates, and correspondence revealed patterns of fraud that could not be explained as clerical errors or administrative oversights. Samuel Grimstead's attempts to manage the investigation through traditional methods proved ineffective against officials who possessed both the authority and determination to pursue their inquiries despite pressure from local business and political interests. The family's previous success in controlling investigations had depended on dealing with officials who lacked either the resources or the motivation to conduct thorough examinations of their activities. The discovery of forged documents bearing official seals and signatures created legal violations that extended beyond local jurisdiction, forcing the involvement of state authorities who possessed resources and expertise that the family's network could not compromise or control. These developments represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the threats facing the operation. Rebecca's psychological assessment indicated that Reverend Hayes possessed personality characteristics that made him unlikely to abandon his investigation in response to threats or bribes, forcing the family to consider elimination strategies that would generate significant risks of detection. The murder of a prominent religious figure would attract attention from church authorities and law enforcement agencies throughout the region. If you're as shocked as we are by how close this evil operation came to permanent success, and how one determined minister's courage changed everything, we need you to be part of exposing these buried truths. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how systematic evil can hide behind religious facades. Hit that like button to support our research into Pennsylvania's darkest secrets, and subscribe because stories this important deserve to reach everyone who's brave enough to confront them. Martha's medical knowledge was deployed to research methods for eliminating Reverend Hayes that would appear to result from natural causes, but the minister's robust health and public visibility made such approaches extremely risky. The family's previous successes in disguising murders had involved victims whose deaths would generate minimal investigation, a condition that clearly did not apply to Hayes. The investigation expanded to include examination of the physical facilities at the Grimstead property, with Sheriff McClellan obtaining legal authority to conduct searches that could reveal evidence of the family's activities. This development forced immediate implementation of the family's contingency plans for evidence destruction and evacuation preparation. Daniel's construction expertise was rapidly deployed to conceal or destroy physical evidence that could confirm the investigators' suspicions, but the extensive modifications to the property over 4 years of operation had created infrastructure that could not be completely eliminated without generating obvious signs of tampering that would itself constitute evidence of criminal activity. Deputy Wintersy's position became untenable as his previous protection of the Grimstead family attracted scrutiny from his new superior, forcing him to choose between continued loyalty to the criminal network and cooperation with the official investigation. His decision to maintain his criminal associations would ultimately provide investigators with additional evidence of the conspiracy's scope and the corruption that had enabled its success. The breakthrough in Sheriff McClellan's investigation came from an unexpected source when 9-year-old Timothy Morrison escaped from the Grimstead property during a snowstorm in November 1895. Timothy had been held in the basement facilities for 6 weeks following his supposed transfer to a reform school in Eerie, and his detailed knowledge of the underground complex provided investigators with the first eyewitness testimony about the family's true activities. Timothy's escape had been facilitated by a structural weakness in one of Daniel's newer construction projects, where inadequate waterproofing had allowed winter moisture to weaken the wooden supports holding a ventilation grate. The boy's small size enabled him to squeeze through the damaged opening and reach the surface, where his cries for help attracted the attention of a neighboring farmer who immediately contacted authorities. The child's testimony revealed the existence of multiple underground chambers that contained evidence of the family's activities, including personal belongings from dozens of missing children, medical equipment used for procedures that had no legitimate educational purpose, and documentation that contradicted the official records the family had provided to parents and government agencies. Sheriff McClellan's examination of Timothy's physical condition provided medical evidence that corroborated the boy's account of his treatment while in Grimstead custody. Martha's medical experiments had left distinctive marks and injuries that Dr. Crawford could not explain as resulting from accidents or necessary medical procedures, forcing the corrupt physician to choose between continued participation in the cover-up and cooperation with the investigation. Reverend Hayes's continued interviews with community members had identified additional families whose children had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, creating a pattern of missing persons cases that extended back to the family's arrival in Clearfield County. His systematic documentation of these cases provided investigators with a comprehensive picture of the operation's scope and methods. The discovery of Margaret Sullivan's personal effects in the basement complex confirmed investigators' suspicions about her death and provided evidence that the family's criminal activities extended beyond child exploitation to include the murder of adults who threatened their security. This finding elevated the investigation to include multiple homicide charges that carried potential death sentences. Samuel Grimstead's attempts to destroy evidence were hampered by the complexity of the underground facilities and the systematic nature of the documentation that the family had maintained for their own operational purposes. For years of meticulous record-keeping had created a paper trail that could not be completely eliminated without obvious signs of tampering that would themselves constitute evidence of criminal activity. Deputy Wintersy's cooperation with the investigation began when Sheriff McClellan confronted him with evidence of his financial relationship with the Grimstead family, including bank records that showed regular payments far exceeding his official salary. Faced with prosecution for corruption and conspiracy charges, Winters agreed to provide testimony about the extent of the criminal network and the methods used to suppress previous investigations. Dr. Crawford's medical authority collapsed when investigators discovered that many of the death certificates he had signed for supposedly deceased Grimstead students contained medical terminology errors that revealed his lack of genuine expertise. His correspondence course credentials and forged medical school documents exposed him as a fraud whose participation in the conspiracy had been motivated by financial gain rather than professional competence. The expansion of the investigation to include state authorities brought resources and expertise that overwhelmed the family's ability to control or suppress the proceedings. Pennsylvania State Police investigators possessed specialized training in complex criminal cases and access to forensic techniques that could definitively establish the scope of the family's activities. Rebecca's psychological evaluation of the investigation's progress indicated that the family's position had become untenable, with multiple sources of evidence converging to create an overwhelming case for prosecution. Her assessment recommended immediate implementation of escape plans while some family members might still avoid capture, but Samuel's refusal to abandon the operation reflected his inability to accept the failure of methods that had proven successful for years. Martha's medical knowledge became a liability as investigators realized that her expertise could not have been acquired through legitimate nursing training, leading to inquiries about her background that revealed her connection to the suspicious deaths at Danvers State Hospital. Massachusetts authorities confirmed that she had fled their jurisdiction while under investigation for patient murders, adding interstate flight charges to her growing list of criminal violations. The testimony of surviving children who had been returned to their families after brief stays at the Grimstead facility provided additional evidence about the family's methods and the systematic nature of their abuse. These witnesses described a carefully organized operation that included multiple staff members and procedures that clearly indicated long-term planning and substantial financial investment. Daniel's construction records, which he had maintained for tax purposes, provided investigators with detailed documentation of the timeline and scope of modifications to the property. These records enabled forensic experts to identify areas where evidence might be concealed and to understand the full extent of the underground facilities that had enabled the family's activities. The financial investigation revealed that the family's apparent prosperity had been supported by income sources that could not be explained through legitimate religious and educational activities. Bank records showed regular deposits from unknown sources and expenditures for supplies and equipment that had no apparent connection to running a Sunday school or charitable organization. The confrontation between law enforcement and the Grimstead family reached its climax on December 15, 1895, when Sheriff McClellan arrived at their property with a warrant authorizing the search of all buildings and grounds. Samuel's initial response followed their standard protocol of presenting documentation and expressing cooperative willingness to assist with any investigation, but the presence of state investigators and federal marshals indicated that this encounter would not be resolved through their traditional methods of misdirection and bribery. Ezekiel's attempt to invoke religious authority as protection against what he characterized as persecution of their Christian mission fell on deaf ears when Reverend Hayes accompanied the law enforcement team and publicly refuted the family's claims about their religious credentials and educational purposes. The minister's presence eliminated the family's ability to portray the investigation as an attack on religious freedom. Martha's medical emergency, which she claimed required immediate attention and postponement of the search, was quickly identified as a deception when the state police physician determined that her symptoms were artificially induced through self-administered medications. Her attempt to delay the investigation through feigned illness demonstrated the family's desperation and their recognition that the search would inevitably uncover evidence of their crimes. The discovery of the basement complex exceeded even the investigators' expectations, revealing facilities that indicated systematic criminal activity on a scale that surpassed any previous case in Pennsylvania's history. The underground chambers contained evidence from dozens of victims, including personal belongings, clothing, and documentation that contradicted every explanation the family had provided for missing children. Rebecca's psychological manipulation techniques proved ineffective against experienced investigators who recognized her attempts to control the conversation and redirect attention away from incriminating evidence. Her efforts to present herself as an innocent victim of her family's activities were undermined by documentation that clearly indicated her central role in identifying and conditioning victims. Daniel's attempts to destroy evidence during the search were prevented by the systematic deployment of law enforcement personnel throughout the property, with guards posted at every exit and investigators monitoring all family members to prevent tampering with potential evidence. His desperate efforts to reach hidden storage areas were blocked by officers who had been briefed on the property's layout based on Timothy Morrison's testimony. The family's network of accomplices began to collapse as news of the investigation spread throughout the region, with previously loyal associates distancing themselves from the operation and providing information to authorities in exchange for leniency. The systematic corruption that had protected the family for years proved fragile when confronted with serious law enforcement pressure backed by state and federal authority. Samuel's final attempt at negotiation involved offering to provide information about other criminal operations in exchange for reduced sentences for his family members, but investigators' discovery of the full scope of their activities made any plea bargaining arrangements politically impossible. The public outrage generated by the case demanded maximum prosecution of all participants. Dr. Crawford's complete cooperation with the investigation revealed the extent of the medical cover-up that had enabled the family's activities, including detailed information about how death certificates had been falsified and official records manipulated to conceal evidence of systematic murder. His testimony provided prosecutors with irrefutable proof of premeditated criminal conspiracy. The attempted destruction of financial records was thwarted when investigators discovered that Samuel had maintained multiple sets of books, including detailed accounts of payments received for various services and expenses related to the disposal of evidence. These records provided prosecutors with comprehensive documentation of the family's criminal enterprise and its financial motivations. Martha's medical supplies included substances and equipment that clearly indicated activities far beyond legitimate nursing care, with investigators discovering surgical instruments, experimental medications, and preservation chemicals that could only be explained as tools for systematic abuse and murder. The quantity and sophistication of these materials demonstrated the industrial scale of the family's operations. Ezekiel's religious library contained materials that contradicted his claims about theological training, including texts on criminal psychology, anatomy, and chemical substances that had no connection to legitimate religious education. These discoveries undermined any remaining credibility for the family's claims about their motivations and purposes. The testimony of additional surviving witnesses, including children who had been returned to their families after brief stays and adults who had observed suspicious activities but previously remained silent, created an overwhelming body of evidence that established both the scope of the crimes and the systematic nature of the cover-up. Rebecca's private journals, discovered hidden in her bedroom, contained detailed observations about victim selection criteria, conditioning techniques, and psychological assessments that demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of the manipulation methods that had made the operation successful. These writings provided prosecutors with insight into the calculated nature of the family's activities. The investigation's expansion to include examination of similar operations in other states revealed that the Grimstead family had been part of a larger network of criminal enterprises that exploited vulnerable children throughout the region. This discovery elevated the case to federal jurisdiction and ensured that maximum resources would be devoted to prosecution and prevention of similar crimes. The forensic examination of the Grimstead property revealed evidence that exceeded investigators' most disturbing expectations, with the systematic excavation of the basement complex uncovering remains from 87 children whose deaths could be definitively attributed to the family's activities. The methodical organization of the disposal sites indicated a level of planning and operational sophistication that transformed the case from local criminal activity into a landmark study of systematic child murder. Samuel Grimstead's desperate escape attempt during the final day of evidence collection demonstrated his recognition that the accumulated proof guaranteed death sentences for all family members. His effort to reach a hidden cache of emergency supplies and forged documentation was thwarted when investigators, guided by Timothy Morrison's detailed knowledge of the property's layout, intercepted him at a concealed exit that Daniel had constructed for such contingencies. Martha's confession, delivered in exchange for a promise of life imprisonment rather than execution, provided investigators with comprehensive details about the medical procedures that had been performed on victims and the methods used to ensure that no evidence of their activities would survive official examination. Her testimony revealed that the family had maintained detailed medical records of their experiments, treating their victims as subjects for research into pain tolerance and psychological conditioning. Rebecca's psychological evaluation by state mental health experts concluded that her participation in the family's activities represented calculated criminal behavior rather than mental illness, eliminating any possibility of an insanity defense and ensuring that she would face the same capital charges as her male relatives. Her sophisticated understanding of child psychology and her systematic application of manipulation techniques demonstrated clear criminal intent. Daniel's construction expertise had created facilities that investigators determined could have accommodated significantly more victims than the confirmed body count, suggesting that the family's 4-year operation in Clearfield County represented only a portion of their total criminal activity. The discovery of construction plans for similar facilities indicated their intention to expand operations to additional locations throughout Pennsylvania. The identification of victims proved challenging due to the family's systematic destruction of identifying materials and their practice of accepting children from distant communities whose disappearances might not generate local investigation. State authorities coordinated with missing persons records from multiple counties and neighboring states to match remains with reports of missing children, ultimately confirming identities for 63 of the 87 recovered victims. Ezekiel's final statement before sentencing attempted to justify the family's activities as necessary research into the spiritual and physical limits of human endurance, claiming that their work would eventually benefit humanity's understanding of divine punishment and redemption. His complete lack of remorse and his continued insistence that their activities served a higher purpose demonstrated the psychological detachment that had enabled years of systematic murder. The trial proceedings attracted national attention as newspapers throughout the country reported details of what journalists characterized as the most horrific child murder case in American history. The systematic nature of the crimes and the family's use of religious authority to gain access to victims generated widespread discussion about the need for improved protection of vulnerable children and better oversight of religious institutions. If this revelation about how 143 innocent children lost their lives to systematic evil is affecting you as profoundly as it should, we need your help to ensure these forgotten victims are finally remembered. Share this investigation with everyone who needs to understand how religious authority can be weaponized against the innocent. Hit that like button to support our commitment to exposing buried truths, and subscribe because stories this important require courage from all of us to ensure they are never forgotten again. The network of accomplices that had enabled the family's operation faced varying degrees of prosecution based on their level of involvement and cooperation with investigators. Deputy Winters received a 20-year sentence in exchange for his comprehensive testimony about corruption within local law enforcement, while Dr. Crawford was sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in creating false documentation and covering up evidence of systematic murder. Harrison Mills and other business associates who had provided supplies and support for the operation received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, with the length of imprisonment determined by the extent of their knowledge about the family's true activities. The comprehensive prosecution of the entire network sent a clear message about the consequences of participating in or enabling systematic criminal enterprises. The investigation's expansion revealed connections to similar operations in Ohio and West Virginia, leading to additional arrests and the discovery of at least 30 more victims whose deaths could be attributed to the larger criminal network. These findings elevated the case to federal jurisdiction and prompted congressional hearings about the need for improved interstate coordination in missing persons investigations. The sale of the Grimstead property was complicated by its association with the crimes and the extensive damage caused by the forensic excavation of the basement complex. The eventual purchaser, a consortium of local churches, demolished all existing structures and converted the site into a memorial garden dedicated to the victims of the family's activities. The impact on surviving family members of victims proved devastating, with several parents requiring institutionalization for mental health treatment following confirmation of their children's deaths. The community's collective guilt about their failure to recognize and stop the systematic abuse led to the establishment of support services and educational programs designed to prevent similar tragedies. The legal precedents established by the Grimstead case influenced child protection laws throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states, including requirements for regular inspection of institutions serving children and improved background verification for individuals seeking positions of authority over minors. These reforms represented the most comprehensive legislative response to child abuse in the nation's history to that point. The pursuit of justice for the Grimstead victims faced unprecedented challenges as the scope of the criminal network continued to expand beyond Pennsylvania's borders, revealing connections to similar operations in 7 states that had collectively exploited over 300 children during the 1890s. Federal authorities coordinated the largest interstate criminal investigation in American history to that point, deploying resources across multiple jurisdictions to identify and prosecute all participants in what investigators now understood was a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Samuel Grimstead's execution on March 15, 1897, marked the first time in Pennsylvania history that capital punishment had been applied to crimes involving systematic child murder, establishing legal precedents that would influence prosecution strategies for similar cases throughout the nation. His final words, expressing regret only for the failure of what he continued to characterize as important research, demonstrated the psychological detachment that had enabled years of systematic violence against children. Ezekiel's execution followed 2 weeks later, but not before his attempted suicide in prison required medical intervention that prolonged his suffering and provided additional time for investigators to extract information about other criminal associates. His detailed confessions, motivated by his desire to ensure that his theological justifications for the family's activities would be preserved for future study, inadvertently provided prosecutors with evidence that led to additional arrests and convictions. Rebecca's life sentence reflected the court's recognition that her psychological expertise had been essential to the operation's success, making her equally culpable despite her gender and her attempts to portray herself as a victim of male family members' influence. Her incarceration in the Eastern State Penitentiary included isolation protocols designed to prevent her from applying her manipulation techniques against prison staff and other inmates. Martha's cooperation with investigators extended beyond her own case to include detailed testimony about medical procedures used by similar operations throughout the criminal network, enabling the identification and prosecution of additional medical professionals who had provided services to child trafficking enterprises. Her comprehensive knowledge of the network's medical infrastructure proved invaluable in understanding the full scope of the systematic abuse. Daniel's sentence of life imprisonment reflected the court's determination that his construction of the facilities had been essential to enabling the family's crimes, making him a full participant rather than merely an accessory to the murders. His detailed knowledge of similar facilities in other locations provided investigators with intelligence that led to the discovery of additional victim sites and the arrest of accomplices who had previously avoided detection. The investigation of the broader criminal network revealed financial connections to legitimate businesses and political figures throughout the region, leading to corruption charges against elected officials and business leaders who had knowingly facilitated the trafficking operations in exchange for financial benefits. These prosecutions demonstrated that the systematic exploitation of children had been enabled by corruption that extended to the highest levels of state and local government. The recovery of additional victims from sites in Ohio and West Virginia brought the total confirmed death toll to over 200 children, making the criminal network responsible for what investigators characterized as the largest systematic child murder case in American history. The geographic scope of the operations required coordination between multiple state governments and federal agencies, establishing precedents for interstate cooperation in criminal investigations. The psychological evaluation of surviving network members revealed patterns of recruitment and indoctrination that helped explain how otherwise ordinary individuals had become participants in systematic child murder. These studies contributed to early developments in criminal psychology and provided insights that influenced law enforcement training and investigative techniques for decades. The Finan SILE investigation uncovered assets and property holdings throughout multiple states that had been acquired through profits from the criminal enterprise, enabling authorities to provide compensation to surviving family members of victims and to fund the establishment of child protection services designed to prevent similar crimes. The systematic seizure of criminal assets represented one of the most comprehensive forfeiture actions in American legal history. The destruction of facilities at locations throughout the network required specialized expertise and coordination between multiple agencies to ensure that all evidence was preserved while eliminating the infrastructure that had enabled systematic abuse. The methodical documentation of these facilities provided researchers with unprecedented insight into the operational methods of large-scale criminal enterprises. The testimony of surviving children who had been rescued from network facilities provided investigators with detailed information about the psychological conditioning techniques that had been used to ensure compliance and prevent resistance. These accounts contributed to the development of therapeutic approaches for treating victims of systematic abuse and informed the creation of protocols for interviewing child witnesses in criminal proceedings. The impact on communities where network operations had been discovered included long-term psychological trauma that required the establishment of specialized support services and community healing programs. The revelation that respected community leaders had participated in or enabled systematic child murder generated lasting distrust of authority figures and institutions that persisted for generations. The legislative response to the Grimstead case and related prosecutions included the establishment of federal oversight for institutions serving children, mandatory background investigations for individuals seeking positions of authority over minors, and improved coordination between state agencies responsible for child welfare. These reforms represented the most comprehensive child protection legislation in American history and established standards that influenced similar laws throughout the developed world. The academic study of the criminal network contributed to early developments in criminology and psychology, with researchers analyzing the systematic nature of the operations to understand how criminal enterprises could operate undetected for extended periods while maintaining community support and official protection. These studies influenced law enforcement training and investigative techniques that proved essential for combating organized crime in the 20th century. The resolution of the Grimstead case established legal and social precedents that fundamentally transformed American approaches to child protection and criminal investigation, with the systematic prosecution of the entire network serving as a model for combating organized criminal enterprises that would influence law enforcement strategies well into the 20th century. The comprehensive nature of the investigation demonstrated the importance of interstate cooperation and federal coordination in addressing crimes that transcended local jurisdictional boundaries. The memorial garden established at the former Grimstead property became a site of pilgrimage for families throughout the region who had lost children to various forms of violence and exploitation, serving as a focal point for community healing and a reminder of the importance of vigilance in protecting vulnerable populations. The annual memorial services conducted at the site drew participants from across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, creating lasting connections between communities that had been affected by the criminal network. Timothy Morrison's survival and testimony proved instrumental not only in securing convictions but also in advancing understanding of childhood trauma and recovery, with his case becoming a landmark study in early psychology and social work. His eventual recovery and successful integration into a loving adoptive family demonstrated the resilience of children and the possibility of healing even after experiencing systematic abuse and witnessing unspeakable violence. The broader impact on American society included fundamental changes in how religious institutions were regulated and monitored, with new requirements for transparency and accountability that prevented the exploitation of religious authority for criminal purposes. These reforms acknowledged that the systematic abuse of children could be facilitated by the very institutions that communities trusted to provide moral guidance and protection for their most vulnerable members. Martha Grimstead's death in prison in 1902 eliminated the last source of detailed information about the network's medical procedures and victim selection criteria, but not before her testimony had contributed to comprehensive documentation of the systematic nature of the abuse and the sophisticated methods used to avoid detection. Her cooperation with investigators had enabled the identification of additional victims and the prosecution of medical professionals who had participated in similar operations. Rebecca's continued incarceration through the early decades of the 20th century provided researchers with opportunities to study the psychological development of individuals who had participated in systematic violence against children, contributing to early understanding of criminal psychology and the factors that enabled ordinary people to become participants in organized atrocities. Her case became a standard reference in criminal psychology textbooks and influenced the development of investigative techniques for identifying and prosecuting similar criminals. The legislative legacy of the Grimstead case extended far beyond Pennsylvania, with states throughout the nation adopting similar child protection laws and establishing agencies dedicated to preventing the exploitation of vulnerable children. The federal coordination that had been essential to investigating and prosecuting the criminal network established precedents for interstate cooperation that proved invaluable in addressing other forms of organized crime throughout the Progressive era and beyond. The community of Clearfield County required decades to recover from the revelation that respected community leaders had participated in or enabled systematic child murder, with the psychological trauma affecting multiple generations and contributing to lasting changes in social attitudes toward authority figures and institutions. The establishment of support services and community healing programs provided models that were adopted by other communities dealing with similar revelations about systematic abuse. The academic study of the criminal network continued throughout the early 20th century, with researchers analyzing the operational methods, psychological dynamics, and social conditions that had enabled such systematic violence to continue undetected for years. These studies contributed to the development of criminology as an academic discipline and influenced the creation of professional standards for law enforcement and social work that emphasized the protection of vulnerable populations. The financial compensation provided to surviving family members of victims established precedents for restitution in criminal cases and demonstrated the importance of addressing the economic impact of criminal violence on affected communities. The systematic seizure and redistribution of criminal assets provided resources for establishing child protection services and support programs that served communities throughout the region for decades. What do you think about this chilling investigation into how systematic evil can hide behind religious authority and community trust? The story of the Grimstead family serves as a permanent reminder that vigilance and courage are required to protect the innocent from those who would exploit positions of trust and authority. Share your thoughts in the comments below about how we can ensure that such systematic abuse never happens again. If this investigation has affected you as deeply as it should, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to join our community of people who refuse to let these buried truths remain hidden. The preservation of evidence and documentation from the Grimstead case created one of the most comprehensive archives of criminal investigation materials in American history, providing resources for researchers, law enforcement professionals, and legal scholars that continue to influence criminal justice practices throughout the 20th century. The systematic documentation of investigative techniques and legal strategies established standards that proved essential for prosecuting complex criminal enterprises. The lasting impact of the case on American culture included the integration of child protection themes into literature, journalism, and social reform movements that characterized the Progressive era, with the Grimstead story serving as a powerful example of the need for systematic reform to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation by trusted authority figures. The Memorial Garden continues to serve its intended purpose. More than a century after the crimes it commemorates, providing a place for reflection and remembrance that honors the victims while educating visitors about the importance of remaining vigilant against the systematic exploitation of children and the abuse of authority that enables such crimes to continue undetected.